did God lead you to start Freedom That Lasts?
Well, that's a fascinating story. A ministry friend of mine in Greenville has worked for years at the Greenville Rescue Mission and had asked me some questions about counseling in years past and would share with me what God was doing in ministry to addicts. And through several conversations with him, I began to have a great burden to minister to those that are addicted. And I actually shared it with my pastor that perhaps at some point God would lead us to start some kind of an addiction ministry. And my pastor, John Monroe, was very open to that. And at the same time, I began renewing an acquaintance with Larry Pearson, who had just moved to Greenville. And he'd spent all of his adult life in addiction ministries. And so these people were in my life, and we were having these discussions. And then my wife and I decided to do some construction on our house and had a bonus room upstairs, and did most of the carpentry work with a relative of mine, but neither one of us wanted to do the drywall. So I hired a crew to come in and do the drywall, and as a witnessing to these men throughout the course of several days, as I was talking to one of them, a young man about 38, he said, my grandmother led me to Christ when I was a little boy, but I've gotten away from God. I've got problems with marijuana and crack, and I can't shake it. And I've been in and out of facilities and in recovery programs here, Christian and secular. And he said, I just been begging God to send somebody my way to help me with this. And he said, I think maybe you're God's answer to my prayer. So tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it. And I said, well, I'll begin meeting with you every day and begin discipling you. So we did that. And as you know, addicts have friends, and he had a half a dozen other friends who were trying to get out of their addictions, and some claimed to be believers and some not. And within just a few days, I'm in the homes of all of these men and women, trying to help them. There were a couple of couples and then a couple of single guys. And that was a very fascinating time. And I did that all throughout that summer, meeting with them. And then when the school year began, when I had to teach in the afternoons, then I had to find a different way to minister to them. So we began meeting on Friday evenings at our church. And my wife and I would leave the house about 6:30, go pick them up, because none of them had driver's license any longer, and pick them up and bring them to church. They would help me set up a Sunday school room with tables and set up the data projector. And I would be writing, I wrote worksheets for them every week, to Bible studies to be doing throughout the week. And then I would give them a lesson, and then my wife would meet with the women separately, and I'd meet with the men, and we'd go over what they were learning in their Bible study in the week. And I would listen to their scripture memory. And they began growing in the Lord. And they began attending church with us and sitting with my wife and me in church. And and our church people just loved them. I mean, they were heavily tattooed and heavily pierced sometimes, and they weren't dressed in Sunday clothes that we would think of, and torn blue jeans and flip-flops. But our people just loved them and took them in and really embraced them and made them feel welcome. And they actually didn't care how we dressed. What they cared about is whether we loved them. And they stayed. They kept coming. And then members of our church who had relatives that were addicted to maybe pain medications or some other drug would ask if they could start bringing their relatives and coming with them. So within a few months, we had 25 attending every Friday night. And it just kind of grew from there. At that time, we were in a position to hire Larry Pearson on a part-time basis to really take over that program. I would concentrate on the curriculum development and developing the program of Freedom That Lasts, and Larry would take care of the discipling of the individuals and running the local chapter. So that's how it got its start back in summer and fall of 2010.
How many people are attending Freedom That Lasts today?
Well, it has gone up and down depending on some of the seasons, but we generally run anywhere between 90 and 100 pretty consistently every Friday night now.
Can you tell us some interesting testimonies that have happened over the years of starting Freedom at Last?
Yes. One that stands out in my mind the most was a very vivacious young man, probably in his mid-30s. His girlfriend had just gotten out of detox, and while in detox, she had heard about Freedom at Last from another man in detox whose wife was attending Freedom at Last. So when she got out of detox, she got a hold of Michael, her boyfriend, and said, we've got to go to Freedom at Last. And so I was doing the newcomers class that night. There were about 5 new attendees that night. I was explaining the program, what we do on Friday nights, and answering their questions. And afterwards, I was just visiting with them a little bit. And I mentioned, I was talking with Michael and his girlfriend, and I said, we're just really glad to have you. And he was tattooed every place you can put a tattoo. And he just said, really? He said, it's okay for me to be here? And I said, oh yeah, you're an image bearer of God. I hope you always feel welcome here. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't say he was a child of God because I didn't know at that time. And he wasn't a child of God at that time, but he's an image bearer of God. And so we wanted to minister to him. And he said, what I'm picking up, he said, I kind of do feel pretty welcome here. He said at her church, he said, they're always looking at me kind of strange and stuff, but he said, I haven't felt that way at all here. And I said, I hope nobody ever makes you feel bad for being here, because we want to minister to you, and everybody else and all of us need to become more like Christ. Mm-hmm. So he, I was conversing with him a little bit more, and I said, what kind of work do you do? And he said, well, I don't have a job. He said, would you hire anybody with this much ink? He said, that's got to be one of the dumbest things I ever did. and he said, I'm looking for a job. And we visited a little bit more. Well, I put him or our director put him into a care group with one of our seminary students who was helping with our ministry. And Michael asked the seminary student, we need to go hang out a little bit, maybe tomorrow night. So he took him over to the snack shop at Bob Jones and for coffee at the coffee shop, and he said, those students, they just came over and they made me feel so welcome. He said, I really felt like this is a really neat place for me to be. And he said, then Jonathan got out his Bible, and before the end of the night, I became a believer in Jesus Christ. He said it was like he was inside my head, and he was taking that Bible and showing me what I needed. And Michael just gave a thrilling testimony, and so Jonathan, his care group leader, began discipling him. And several weeks later, he was baptized. Oh, he just devoured the Bible. He just would read it. He didn't have a job, and he would just read it by the hour every day. And it was really, really growing in the Lord. And the night of his baptism was a very special night. There was another young lady that was attending Freedom at Last. She came from a very, very difficult home situation. And a lot of just horrible things had gone on in her life. And she was wondering, she knew she needed God and needed to be saved, but she was wondering how God would let this kind of stuff happen to her. And so her care group leader and I were trying to minister to her. And she was just really struggling with that, about salvation and about God not being very loving and allowing her to experience so much pain. Well, when Mike was getting baptized, he was giving his testimony, and he said, I was reading just yesterday in the last several chapters of Luke. He said, I've just been reading from Matthew straight through, and he said, I got that place about Jesus being crucified with those 2 thieves. And he said, and they were mocking Jesus. And he said, I used to mock Jesus. And then he said, there's that point where that one says, I want to be, remember me when you enter into your kingdom. And Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. And Michael said, I'm like that thief now. I'm going to be with him in paradise. It was just a thrilling testimony. Well, during that time, this other young woman, she's texting her care group leader. And she said, I have to have what Michael has.
Oh, wow.
And that night after church, then her care group leader got to lead her to Christ. And several weeks later, when she was baptized, she gave her testimony as well. It's just exciting to watch God transform lives. And then, in those baptismal testimonies for the entire church to hear what God is doing. Mm-hmm. And it just galvanizes everybody about the importance of the gospel and how it can just transform people. And it's had a revolutionary effect in our church. Folks are witnessing the gospel that were reticent to do it before, and bringing people to church and bringing them to freedom at last. And realizing on a fairly regular basis, they're seeing people baptized because they've been converted, and seeing the power of the gospel and changing people's lives. So it's just been exciting for us.
Oh, praise God. What are some positive things that Freedom Last has done to the church family?
Well, it's had a phenomenal impact. Our pastor, Pastor Monroe, said it's probably the most strategic evangelistic arm into our community that we have in our church. We have a regular visitation program, and we have other outreaches, for the Sunday school and so forth. But it brings a regular flow of unsaved people into the Friday night meetings and into Sundays. Because part of the program, if they're going to advance in the curriculum, is they have to attend church a number of times. As they go into the curriculum, it becomes more, they got to be at church 3 times a week instead of just one at the beginning. And many of them are not churched, so they come to where Freedom at Last is, and it's brought unsaved people into our congregation, and then they get converted and baptized and join our church and minister. And actually, one of the strengths of Freedom at Last is that it is connected to a local church. And in fact, we call everyone that comes, we don't call them addicts, we call them students. And the students who really make it are the ones who stay faithful in the church, where they're ministered to by the body, and they hear regular preaching and feel a sense of accountability. And they're the ones who really grow. I think the other thing it's done for our church is it's mobilized a lot of people, church members, to get involved in a ministry in ways that they feel like they really could do something on this level. They can drive a minivan to go pick up somebody, or they could be care group leaders. Care group leaders don't have to know a lot about addictions. In fact, I tell our care group leaders, even if you've never experienced drugs or alcohol, you have more in common with an addict than you have different from an addict. Because all of us know what it's like to give in to a sin repeatedly, even when we know it's destroying something in our lives and it's tearing us down. All of us know that experience. And Paul tells us that our temptations are common to man. Now, we may not have chosen the same exact things to life-dominating sins that have a chemical addiction to it as well. But all of us know this experience of struggle against our flesh. So we have people who are care group leaders who would never feel like they could teach a Sunday school class, or never feel like they could be a youth sponsor, but they can be a care group leader, and they can listen to verses being said and check them off, and they can take prayer requests, and they can do this thing. And they do some amazing growing just by being involved in that process. And it's also mobilized people to do other service-oriented kinds of things. We actually feed everyone who comes Friday night. So, we're feeding 100 people on Friday nights. And that food comes from members of our church who sign up on a weekly basis to bring food. And so we have a lot of people who are contributing food, making finger sandwiches and sloppy joes or something, and bringing chips and soda and that kind of thing. And they wouldn't feel like they could do anything else significant in the church, but they can be a part of this ministry. We encourage them to stay around if they want and see what's going on, and it makes them feel a part of that. And then we have a couple of couples that help set up all of that food during the meeting and get ready for that. And so it's mobilized a lot of people. And we have 3 or 4 people at the welcome table and working with the software and entering the data of those people. So it takes probably between 15 to 20 people every Friday night to make that happen when you're servicing a group of about 100 people. And that has just engaged a lot of people, and they listen to the testimonies of what God is doing, and they feel very much a part of that, and they're motivated. And we have care group leaders who have been with us from the very beginning 4 years ago and are still not burned out. I mean, they've had some weeks, I'm sure, where they've thought, I don't know if I can continue to do this, but it's done so much for our church in that way. It's renewed a sense of evangelism and demonstrated, and it's helped them understand what real biblical love is. The church is here to meet needs. If a church is doing its job, it ought to have people in the congregation struggling with homosexuality. It ought to have people in the congregation struggling with drugs and alcohol, or struggling with immorality and pornography, because that means we're reaching our communities. And Paul didn't build his churches in Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi out of people who transferred from another church in town. I mean, these are people that he led to Christ in the marketplace and in prison.
Amen.
And brought and formed whole churches out of those people. And it's been exciting to see that happen.
What type of life-dominating sins do you minister to in the church with Freedom That Lasts?
We're really a broad spectrum of life-dominating sins, all the way from the chemical addictions. No, we don't detox anybody. That has to be done in a medical facility. But we work with men and women who are addicted to cocaine or crack or heroin, marijuana, cigarettes, and alcohol, of course. But then the behavioral, I guess we quote addictions as well. Overeating, anorexia, bulimia, cutting, anger, rage, all of those are manifestations of the flesh in one way or another. And the solution is going to be the discipleship of the heart to learn who God is and to learn how to submit to God and how to find satisfaction in God instead of something else in the creation. When Adam and Eve sinned, they turned from God as the primary source of wisdom and help and fulfillment. They turned to something in the creation. And that has been our propensity ever since, to worship and serve the creature, that's ourselves, rather than the Creator. And anytime you turn to something in the creation to make life work, you're going to become enslaved to that part of the creation. And we work with men and women who the world would call functional addicts. That means generally they have a place to stay and they have some kind of means of support. May not be regular work, but they're day workers or hourly workers. And so we don't have to find housing for them or really support them. But their substance abuse or their behavioral habituation is interfering with productivity, with their family, with their health in some way, their finances. So we're not working with the homeless generally. The rescue mission in our town deals with the homeless. But these are, this is a Friday night ministry, and of course our care group leaders work with them throughout the week as they have time. So it would be more like an outpatient kind of a situation rather than a resident situation. And we've seen God do some amazing things in all of those life-dominating sins.
Can you speak to the pastor that has a burden to minister to people with life-dominating sins that are so prevalent in the world today?
Okay. A pastor needs to do a couple of things. One, he really needs to begin praying that God would send him some layman in his congregation who would have a burden for this. Because to start a Freedom at Last chapter is not something your average pastor can add onto his workload. And so he needs to be praying that God would burden a layman for this. And he might know a layman in his church that maybe came from a similar drug background or alcohol background. although it doesn't have to be a person from that background, just somebody who's burdened for people who are enslaved. So he needs to begin praying that God would send him someone. And the second thing I would encourage him to do is to begin to prepare his people for reaching the community in this way. That if we're doing our job, then our church had to be a cross section of our neighborhoods, and not just one class of people, so to speak. And that's a new thing for some congregations. We take people wherever they are. We don't intend to leave them there. But just as Jesus ministered to people of all strata of society, but he didn't leave people where they were. He brought them to himself, and when they were converted, they became different people, and they grew, and so forth. So he needs to prepare his people for that. And our pastor very wisely did that. And in fact, he was, as he was doing that over the course of several weeks, and just mentioning, that we're going to be starting a ministry here, and there'll be people in here that don't look like us. And he said, he was very strong but kind and pastoral about it, but he said, I never want to hear that any member of our church ever fussed at somebody because he had a tattoo, or he has body piercings, or he's not dressed like us. He said, this is the ministry of the church, is to take the gospel to the nations. Amen. And we can't be a church that is say you have to look like us to come to our church, or you have to dress like us to come to our church. So that's very important, that he prepares congregation for that.
So if a pastor has prayed about this, has some people in the congregation that can help him with an addiction ministry like Freedom That Lasts, and he's prepared the people and he's ready, what would be the next steps for him to take to become a chapter of Freedom That Lasts?
Okay. I would encourage him to visit our website, www.freedomthatlast.com, and read through the history there, read through the doctrinal statement, and there is a page there for chartering. And Freedom That Lasts is a registered trademark. Anybody can use our curriculum, but they can't call it a Freedom That Lasts program without chartering with us. And there's a doctrinal statement that they have to sign, certain things they have to agree to, that this will be an evangelistic ministry, and that they give opportunities for the gospel to be given and for people to respond to the gospel. And it can't be blended with secular groups, AA groups, or anything like that. And they can fill out a charter application and sign the doctrinal statement and send that to us, and then we can approve them for a charter membership. If they contact us through our website, I will also send them a PDF of our leaders guide, which will show them the whole program of what needs to go on, and what people you have to have and train, and so forth. So we'll provide them for the material to look that over. And really, what's exciting for me is to be here in Canada and to be speaking with you here at Lighthouse, and starting a Canadian home office here, so that folks signing up from Canada can get the materials through Lighthouse Baptist here, and save all the shipping of getting it up here from the States. So it's very exciting to see this expand to another country, and glad that Lighthouse is a part of this now.